A shocking true crime case, a cruise ship disaster, a Hollywood scandal. What do these all have in common? December 2nd, 1994. On this day 30 years ago, headlines captivated the world with stories of murder, survival, and fame. We start in Gloucester, England, a quiet city with a dark secret. On December 2nd, 1994, Fred West, a 53-year-old builder, was charged with 12 brutal murders. His wife, Rose, faced charges for 10 of them. But these numbers only scratch the surface of the horror that unfolded at their house, a place forever known as the House of Horrors. Fred and Rose represented themselves as an ordinary working-class couple, but their lives were actually pretty twisted. Their crimes began in the 1960s, escalating over 2 decades. They specifically targeted vulnerable young women, specifically hitchhikers and runaways, who they invited to their home under false pretenses. Fred, known for his charm and handyman skills, would often offer them jobs or lodging. Once inside, though, the nightmare began. The methods used were often cruel. Victims were tortured for days, subjected to unspeakable abuse, and eventually killed. What makes this case particularly chilling is the involvement of both Fred and Rose. Rose not only participated, but often took the lead in the abuse. Many of the bodies were dismembered and buried in either the garden or beneath the floorboards, hidden in shallow graves that Fred dug himself. Even more horrifying, 2 of their own children were victims. Their oldest daughter disappeared in 1987, and when her siblings started to ask where she was, Fred and Rose would joke that she was under the patio. It wasn't just a cruel joke, though. It was the horrifying truth. Their daughter Heather's murder was pivotal in solving the case. The investigation began when one of their other daughters confided to a friend about the abuse she was experiencing. Social services got involved, and eventually, the police were called. When Heather's disappearance couldn't be explained, police got a search warrant to excavate the garden. What they found was beyond human comprehension. Human remains buried beneath the patio, just as Fred had joked. As police dug further, more bodies were discovered. Victims included lodgers, young women they had picked up, and tragically, their own daughter. The scale of the crimes were staggering, with the murders occurring between 1967 and 1987. Fred West was arrested first. During interrogations, Fred confessed to the murders, but insisted that Rose had no involvement. However, the evidence told a different story. Rose was equally complicit and was soon arrested as well. Fred later took his own life in prison on New Year's Day, 1995, leaving Rose to face justice on her own. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her involvement, including witness testimonies from surviving victims. Rose maintained her innocence, portraying herself as a victim of Fred's manipulations. But the jury wasn't convinced. After a highly publicized trial, she was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. To this day, she remains in prison as one of the UK's most famous female serial killers. What makes this story even more chilling is how ordinary they appeared to outsiders. Neighbors described Fred as a friendly man, always willing to lend a hand, and Rose was seen as a devoted mother. Next, we head to the coast of Somalia, where on December 2nd, 1994, a disaster brought an end to the famous cruise liner Achille Lauro, a ship with a history of drama, luxury, and tragedy. The Achille Lauro was built in 1947, and after being sold to the Italian shipping company Lauro Lines in the 1960s, it became a symbol to Mediterranean luxury cruising. But things changed on October 7th, 1985, when Palestinian terrorists hijacked a vessel off the coast of Egypt. The incident escalated when the hijackers executed an American tourist, a disabled man who used a wheelchair. The murder shocked the world, and its reputation was forever altered. But the cruise ship still attracted passengers seeking adventure. In November 1994, the ship was sailing from Italy to South Africa with 1,000 passenger and crew on board. By the time it reached the waters off the coast of Somalia, the ship seemed to be on a routine voyage. But just before dawn, a fire broke out in the engine room. At first it seemed manageable, but within minutes, the flames spread rapidly, fueled by the ship's aging infrastructure. Smoke filled the hallways, and panic set in among the passenger and crew. Alarms blared, and evacuation procedures began. However, confusion and fear made the situation even more chaotic. Passengers rushed to the lifeboats, but not all were seaworthy. Some lifeboats malfunctioned, leaving passengers stranded on the deck. The crew worked tirelessly to maintain order and guide people to safety, but the flames were relentless. Rescue operations were hindered by the ship's remote location. Several ships and helicopters, including the US Navy, responded to the distress call. Tragically, 2 people lost their lives during the ordeal. One died from injuries sustained in the fire, and the other drowned after falling from a lifeboat. For the rest of the passengers, the hours spent in lifeboats were filled with fear and anxiety. Eventually, rescuers arrived, and over the next several hours, passengers were pulled from the lifeboats and taken to safety. Many were treated for smoke inhalation and minor injuries, but the psychological toll of the disaster was evident. Survivors later described the event as surreal, like a scene from a disaster movie. As the last of the survivors were rescued, the ship remained on fire, listing heavily to one side. By the early evening, it was clear that the ship could not be saved, and on December 2nd, it eventually sank, disappearing into the depths of the Indian Ocean. The incident served as a sobering reminder of how quickly disaster can strike at sea. Next, we head to Hollywood, where a jury handed down a verdict that rocked the city. Heidi Fleiss, known to tabloids and television audiences as the Hollywood Madam, was found guilty of running one of the most exclusive prostitution rings in Los Angeles. Born in 1965 in Los Angeles, she was born in a relatively affluent household. However, the allure of fast money and a life of luxury pulled her in a different direction. By her early 20s, she had crossed paths with Elizabeth Adams, a well-known figure in the world of high-end prostitution. Under her mentorship, Fleiss learned the ins and outs of the business. But Heidi wasn't content with being an apprentice for long. By the early 90s, she had branched out and created her own empire. Her client list was A-list celebrities, influential directors, wealthy businessmen, and even international figures. Things began to unravel in June of 1993, when law enforcement received a tip about Fleiss's activities. A sting operation led to her arrest in a Beverly Hills hotel. What followed was a media frenzy. Journalists speculated endlessly about the names in her famous Black Book, and the public was captivated by the possibility that one of their favorite stars might be implicated. Despite intense speculation, Fleiss remained quiet about her client list, a move that likely earned her some respect in the power circles. But her silence didn't save her. The prosecution focused on the charges of pandering and tax evasion. They painted a picture of Fleiss as a savvy businesswoman who exploited the desires of the rich and the famous. The defense, however, attempted to portray her as a scapegoat, a victim of an overzealous prosecutor, eager to make an example of her. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found her guilty on 3 counts of pandering and 1 count of tax evasion. Fleiss was acquitted of the more serious drug charges and was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in prison, serving just 20 months before her release. And that was 30 years ago, December 2nd, 1994. Which story do you remember? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting facts that happened exactly 30 years ago every day.